Most of us are concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim racism. And what the government has offered us is tools of surveillance as a way to mitigate these forms of racism. Historically, the United States has said, yes, the more surveillance, monitoring, and criminalization we have, the more we can reduce these forms of racial violence. But we know historically that surveillance, monitoring, and criminalization doesn't actually reduce racial violence. It actually increases racial violence by targeting the very people who are the targets of racism. And so we see this with growing fears of anti-Semitism. The call has been to survey and monitor Palestinian liberation movements.
We're very focused on the data we're collecting from surveillance efforts. What's being said on social media platforms?
These are actually not the sources of anti-Semitism, and especially the really scary forms of anti-Semitism. I'm from the Midwest, and we just had a neo-Nazi rally in Madison, right? Really terrifying form of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And yet this was something that was able to be done in public, that was covered in the media, and that wasn't actually criminalized or prevented. I think that's what makes this political moment really dangerous, is because it's allowing for and sustaining and fostering really scary forms of racist violence, because we're so afraid that Palestinian liberation movements are themselves anti-Semitic, when pro-Palestinian movements are just calling for the freedom and liberation of Palestine. And so we have to really question, are these tools of surveillance and social media monitoring the ways to actually keep us safe, or are they actually intended, and this has been across history, to repress liberation movement work? We need to pay attention to two forms of surveillance and monitoring that's happening. And that's, on the one hand, state-sponsored surveillance, which is being done by federal, state, and local governments, law enforcement agencies, and so on. And so this is looking like identifying, reporting, taking down pro-Palestinian Twitter posts, for example. The second, though, is also sort of vigilantes who have taken up this work, who are following people, who are videoing people, who are taking photographs of people, and then posting them on websites like Canary Mission as a form of intimidation and harassment. So there's both the criminalization by the state through formal policies that empower law enforcement agencies to monitor and arrest people based on their social media posts, and also the emboldening and empowering of everyday people to undertake this work across the country. I'm on a college campus, and there's graffiti all over campus saying "Free Palestine," for example. It makes no mention of Israel, it makes no mention of Jewish people, but it gets reported as a hate crime. And these Free Palestine writings are oftentimes next to additional graffiti that explicitly calls for the extermination of Palestinians. And that kind of graffiti doesn't get reported and never gets interpreted as a hate crime. And so what we're seeing is that some forms of political expression, namely that of Palestinian liberation, gets coded as racist violence. And what is really clearly anti-Palestinian racist violence get coded as just free political expression that needs to be protected. And so we really need to think about the policing and criminalization of Palestinian liberation movements as not just something the police do, but people who feel empowered and emboldened to essentially function as the police.